Well, here we are again. Hope it is a good evening for each of you. Hope you've had a good afternoon. It's good to be back with you this evening. I'm thankful to be here. Thankful that we can open up God's Word and share from His Word together tonight. So thank you for being here. It's nice and, I'm not going to say it's nice and cool in here, especially I'm the guy standing up here with the jacket on, but it is cooler in here than it is out there. So if nothing else, thanks. I'm glad you decided to come inside the AC tonight. But hopefully, there's a bit more to it than just that. And that might make a nice segue into integrity this evening. No, there's not an overhead, so you've got to stay awake enough to fill out the handout by trying to keep up with me. And, I never get fast or anything like that, so if I go too fast, don't raise your hand unless you just can't stand it and your integrity is at stake. But there's that question. If you did pick up, there's a handout, and so if you picked up a copy of the handout, he's already lost. I mean, when the song leader's lost. But there's that question at the top of the handout, or hopefully it's there. What about me? What about you? Are you a person of integrity? Because that's really what it comes down to, isn't it? I mean, we can talk about, here's what integrity is, and we're getting to that. But just to talk about it in this almost abstract way, here's integrity, it's a great thing, to never come back home and say, where am I with this integrity issue? And so we start there. Now, I suppose our humility might be at stake if we're too eager to throw up the positive yes and say, oh, yes, that's me, and stand up and say, I'm a person of integrity. That's who I am. But I think there's a place there for recognition and a place there for maybe recognition the other way and say, no, I've got some failings. I've got some things I need to work on when it comes to integrity. But let's make sure we're on the same page. What is integrity? Integrity is usually defined in two main ways. One is that it describes someone who has this tenacity about them, where they have principles. They have a reputation of being someone that you can count on in a situation where there is a right decision, a right way to go, and there might be more than one wrong choice. Maybe not 10 out of 10, but 9 out of 10, something like that. As a whole, they're going to stick to their principles. They're someone that might approach something and it's, well, no, this violates my conscience. This goes against my principles. It is, they'll say, a matter of principle here. So a strong moral character might be the way to wrap that idea up. The other idea is about wholeness. Or to put it in the negative, it's about not being divided on the inside. And you can see how these connect then, that I have a whole character here. And so I'm not someone who follows the waves of opinion or popularity. I don't just make decisions based on how I feel about them or even what my opinion is. I have something deeper inside me. I might even have a higher standard or authority that I seek to follow with my whole heart, my whole life. So it is not perfection, but integrity is maybe the closest you can get to sinless perfection. It's a kind of wholeness, or the Bible uses the word blamelessness, where there's not, you look at a person like this and you say, yeah, they've got some issues, they're not perfect, but it's almost difficult to really point a finger and say, yeah, they've got that problem because of the wholeness of their life. Someone put it this way, that character is who you are. Integrity is about how long you hold on to who you are. That may come up again here in a few minutes. I like this one too. Before we move on, someone else wrote it this way. In the context of leadership, that applies far beyond just leaders, they said this, that integrity is when my words and my actions are consistent Consistency has a whole lot to do with integrity, right? But they didn't stop there. And I think sometimes we stop there, and that's not being a hypocrite, right? It's when what I say and what I do align. The whole, somebody says, don't do what I do, just do what I say. This writer says it's when my words and my actions are consistent with my intentions. That one cuts deeper. That is a much higher standard to examine ourselves in view of. The Bible uses a few different words that we translate as integrity, blameless, upright, righteous, that all are related to this core idea of integrity. So a case study tonight. Let's look at some cases, some examples in the Bible, and I put them in three different arenas of life. There's the season of opportunity first. Then there's the season of misery. So all this under integrity. You might see an easy way to remember these words. Opportunity, misery, and then immorality. Integrity in a season of immorality. We'll get there. Before I go any further, I'm going to give credit to where credit is due. I stole this outline from somebody else. I had never put these three people together in this way. Now, from there, I made it my own. I fleshed it out and all of that and made these seasons. But Mark Posey, he preaches in North Alabama. He gave me this basic idea. I stole it from him, and then it's yours tonight. Okay? Let's look at opportunity first then. Let's turn together to Genesis chapter 20 as we look first at the story. Genesis 20. This whole chapter tells the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Abimelech. We don't know much about this Abimelech character. He is a king. He has a name that is used of other people later. Now, just a few chapters later in Genesis, an Abimelech comes up with Isaac. And some think it's the same Abimelech, some think it's his son. Because Abimelech in Hebrew, it's more of a title for someone who is in the succession of kingship. And so it might be, you might think of Caesar, how it starts with Julius Caesar, and then that became a royal name in a way for those in the line of emperors in Rome. It kind of happens here, it seems, with Abimelech. So there's multiple Abimelechs in the Bible. This is one of them. Now, he is far from perfect. We're back to that again. I don't know that you could say everything he does in this chapter. There's the possibility that he even has some sin here. It gets a little difficult to nail down based on what he says and what, more importantly, based on what God says to him about him. But he stands out as a person interacting with the one that's supposed to be the righteous one, Abraham, as a person of integrity. Let's read it together. It says, from there Abraham journeyed toward the territory of Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And so he journeyed in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And if you look at the second line there, or you look at the comparison text there in chapter 12, verses 10 through 20. First time this happens. And it's right after, especially as you're reading the text, it's right after God calls Abraham and Abraham goes, that he makes the same agreement. Let's tell Pharaoh there. We're just siblings. Now, they are siblings, but they're a little more than just siblings, right? And I think sometimes we might go in the other direction. Sometimes I've heard people, and it's almost like this ruins Abraham for them. Because he does this, he's just a horrible person now. I think sometimes we might harp too much on Abraham, all right? He does this out of fear. Is it good? No. But he has his reasons. Are they good reasons? That's debatable. I don't want to go the other way and say, he's totally innocent here. That's part of what makes this so interesting, is that Abraham tries to play this off to protect himself from Abimelech. Some of this culturally seemed to be about kings, and if you're a king, you have this harem, And I mean, Solomon does this later. And so he's thinking, okay, he's going to want Sarah. Sarah is not young at this point, and so some people wonder, what did she really look like at this point? Okay, she's approaching a century, and back with Pharaoh, she's a few years younger. Is this about her beauty? Is this about connection with the successful, powerful shepherd Abraham? Some people think that ironically, the idea is that Abimelech would want Sarah to attach himself to Abraham. But Abraham says, hey, you're just my sister, so he doesn't kill me to take you. There's lots going on here, right? And so we keep reading. He says, she is my sister. And that's when Abimelech goes and he takes Sarah. It says he sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in verse 3 in a dream by night. And isn't that something? Wouldn't you think that God would go to Abraham first? Now, does that say something about who's who in this story? Maybe. Or then again, that's just how God did it, right? I mean, we don't know. But it almost looks like Abimelech already is shining a bit here brighter than Abraham. Integrity. He comes to him in a dream and says, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. She's not just a man's sister. Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? He pleads his innocence here on the basis of ignorance. And there's a balance here of the recognition that sometimes we fall into something and we don't know all the details. That doesn't excuse it, but it is something that is important to take note of. And God takes note of that. It doesn't mean that it's okay, but it does matter. So, he says, she herself said to me, he is my brother. And then look at this line. Here's where the word is used. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. And all he's done so far is just bring her into his tents. He hasn't approached her, remember? Now, some say that's because he just hadn't had time yet. He has a whole harem, okay? You can just kind of let your imagination work there. Or is there something more here? And look at what happens in the rest of the text. It says, then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart. So he's not lying when he says, my heart's pure, my integrity remains, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. So God's already been at work in this. And so you put that together. There's Abimelech's integrity, but there's also God's providence. And here, in a way, God gives Abimelech the option. Now, you could say, yeah, God had already said you're a dead man. So maybe you could look at his fear here involved. But really, God says, I kept you from sinning so far. I've given and am giving you a way out to not go through with this. What do? And it's a reminder to me that in seasons when there is an opportunity for sin, that God will be at work, for sure, if I'm a Christian, if I'm his child, to also give me an opportunity, that word goes both ways here, to, in a way, escape the temptation. Does that ring a bell? That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, or 1 Corinthians 10, rather, verse 13. There's a 13 in there somewhere. He says that temptation that overcomes us isn't somehow special, but that in the temptation, God provides what? A way of escape. Retroactively, what Paul writes in principle in 1 Corinthians seems to be at work here in a way. But what we see, why I call it opportunity first, is because Abimelech, he's king. Abraham basically gives Sarah to him. We talk about an opportunity. And then God says, here's the real opportunity. Will you maintain that integrity and innocence? Now let's read the rest of the story. He says, therefore I did not let you touch her. Now then, return this man's wife. For he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. Abraham's got a job to do, intercessory job here. If you do not return, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. So verse 8, Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them these things. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing? What really motivated you here?" And then he says, Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see?" And Abraham said, "I did it because I thought, there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." And yet, multiple times in this chapter, Abimelech and his people express a fear or a reverence for God. So besides, she is indeed my sister. You could kind of see that as Abraham still trying to justify it, right? He's saying, well, I was afraid. I didn't think you feared God. She is actually my sister and the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother. And then she became my wife. And when God calls me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, "This is the kindness you must do me. In every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother." And then this last paragraph, and we'll finish the story. It says, "Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah his wife to him." And that's the thing. Regardless of what you exactly conclude about Abimelech and all of the intentions and motivations that are at work in his heart, the bottom line is, throughout this, at the end of the day, he does the right thing. And even more so, right? Here he's just trying to make sure everything is good. He doesn't just say, here's Sarah back. Here's some contributions too. And Abimelech said, "Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you." To Sarah he said, "Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign." Here's the extent of the integrity of his heart in the previous paragraph. He says, "It is a sign of your innocence." By the way, that word innocence, it's related to that word integrity of heart in the previous paragraph or two. It's a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you. Before everyone you are vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female servants so that they bore children. It's not explicit, but something was going on with Abimelech's health. He gets the dream, and apparently along the way he gets a health issue, and the women's wombs are closed. For the Lord had closed, the last part says, all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. From a more technical standpoint, it seems that part of why this chapter is here is that when you get to the next chapter and Sarah conceives and bears a son, the promised son, the reader has no doubts who the father is. He doesn't have to question, well, if she was hanging out with Abimelech. Well, it's made extra clear Abimelech didn't touch her, and those in his household, the wombs were closed. And then Isaac is born in the next chapter. That's the story of a man in an opportune situation. Now, I reference in the handout the previous passage from Genesis 19, 30 through 38. We're not going to read that together. You're welcome to on your own. If you've read through Genesis much, it's probably a story that stands out. Or maybe it's one that you have tried to forget. But it's an unfortunate contrast with Lot and really his daughters in seeking and seizing a different opportunity. But it's this contrast of this perversion sexually. And then Abimelech has her in his household. And yet, he maintains his integrity. And then there's a good comparison. And that's later with Joseph. Joseph in Genesis 39, 7 through 18, where Joseph asks a similar question. There it's, how can I do this great sin and wickedness against my God, when he is also given maybe an even better opportunity from the sexually immoral standpoint. Potiphar's wife. And he eventually runs out of the house in Genesis 39. How many people walk around and the only reason, people have said this, usually on the other side, after it's happened and they confess, but they walked around sometimes for years, even decades, to borrow from Jesus, having already committed adultery in their heart. But unlike some others, they weren't willing to go out and seek it. It was only a matter of opportunity. And they said, I had this mindset that was, yeah, if the right opportunity comes along, why not? And people have played around with this with their friends. They make jokes about it. If you could magically snap your fingers and you have sexually anybody that you want, maybe it's a celebrity or maybe it's somebody you know, and there are no consequences socially, your relationships, financially, nothing changes, nobody ever knows, what would you do? Because sometimes, for whatever reason, because we do value what we have and we're afraid to lose it, whatever's happening in our minds, sometimes integrity, our integrity, is just a matter of opportunity. This doesn't just have to be about sexual immorality. It might be finding, it's one thing to go out and rob a convenience store. It's another thing to find the wad of cash on the sidewalk. Opportunity. It's like the story of the two runners in a cross-country event in Colorado, Nevada. You might look that up. But there's a Spanish runner and a Kenyan runner. The Spanish runner, Anaya, he's behind. And Mutai, I'm probably butchering their names. I don't really speak Spanish or Kenyan. But Mutai is about to win the race. Anaya is not far behind. He's trailing him. And somehow, 30 feet, or 30 yards from the finish line, Mutai thinks he's crossed the finish line. And in his confusion, Anaya has it. All he has to do is keep running. And he wins the race. But he said later, every time he looked at that gold medal, he would have remembered the time he had the opportunity to do the right thing and didn't. The opportunity to choose kindness, his words were, over victory. And so instead of winning the race, he stops and explains and gestures to Mutai, you haven't made it yet. And Mutai wins the race. Integrity in a season of opportunity. Now let's turn from Genesis 20 now to Job. Job chapter 1, the season of misery. Job is a very small book. But really, if you read the whole book, and it gets difficult, especially if poetry is not your thing, and that's about 50-50 probably, maybe less in our culture. But there's some debate as to the end of the story. I think it's significant that God has Job offer sacrifices for his friends at the end. But at least at the beginning, it is clear that even through everything that Job goes through, he holds on to his integrity. He holds on to that character. Remember, character is who you are. Integrity is whether you can hold on to it or how long you hold on to it. Look at Job chapter 1, verse 1. The book opens this way. There was a man in the land of Uz. This is before the misery, whose name was Job. And that man was blameless. That word's related to integrity. And upright. One who feared God and turned away from evil. Those phrases are found throughout the Proverbs. A couple of these words are used of both Noah and Abraham. Abraham is in here, back in chapter 17 of Genesis. He was blameless and upright. And then it begins to describe his family and his possessions. And if you drop down to verse 8, this is when Satan has become before God. And here's that question God keeps asking Job. In verse 8, let's read it together. The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on the earth." And then he quotes from the beginning of the passage, "Blameless and upright, who fears God, turns away from evil." And Satan is no fool. He knows how some of us operate. So he retorts back, "Well, is it really for nothing?" Have you ever asked yourself that? What if somehow, I mean, it's really hypothetical, and I don't like to really deal in hypotheticals much, but this one is interesting, I think. What if somehow God had never done anything good for me? I mean, again, it's really tricky because if you're alive, God gave you life. But if somehow God had never blessed me, I couldn't point to anything in my life that was good from God. I just had the worst, most miserable life ever. Could I still give worship and praise to God for who He is, regardless of what He has or hasn't done for me personally? So that's part of the theology here in Job. And so God says, okay. And Job loses everything. Look at Job chapter 1, verse 20 now. I think it's one of the key passages in the whole book. Job 1, verse 20. We see Job's grief. He loses his children. He loses his finances. And here's what he does. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head. So before, now during, and fell on the ground. There's his grief. But he's also on the ground for a different reason, because and worship. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And then this little line in verse 22. In all this misery, in all of this response, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. And then it picks up again, chapter 2. God has the same question for Satan. Satan still comes back with, "Well, I haven't been able to actually touch him." And so he continues. Look at verse 9 of Job chapter 2. After Satan takes his help from him, and he is literally sitting in misery, and misery loves company, here's what happens. Verse 9. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your" what? "Integrity. The season of misery. Curse God and die." He said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speak. You sound like a pagan who doesn't believe in the true and living God. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" Remember, Job has no idea of the behind-the-scenes heaven scene with Satan and God. In fact, Job never does. And yet he says, the writer then observes, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Some take that as implication he sinned without his lips, but I think that misses the point here. I've got a picture. I stole it too, so I didn't actually steal it, okay? It was a hand-me-down of sorts. But I've got this picture, sits right above where I usually sit in my office to study. And it's the song, "It Is Well With My Soul." But I find myself glancing up at that periodically in my days, sitting in there, and what usually catches my eye is not the lyrics of the song, but the name, Horatio Spafford. And when he wrote the lyrics to that song. Job is the ancient example. Horatio might be a more modern example of a Job-like integrity. He had lost most of his finances in the Chicago fire of 1871. About a year later, there was the panic that happened, and that messed up his finances. He'd been going through some difficulties from the banking standpoint. And so he decides that he and his family, his wife, and his 4 daughters, aged 1 to 9, 1, 5, 7, and 9, are going to take a vacation to Europe. And so they get to New York where they're to board the ship. And then there's a last-minute change of plans, business-wise. He needs to stay and take care of some things. So he says, go ahead, enjoy the trip. I'll catch up to you later. As the story goes. And there's a lot of connections here to a previous ship that sank in the Atlantic. Or as a ship that sinks later. But, I can't get my details right. Some of you know what I'm talking about, and you're laughing at me. That's good. Glad somebody can keep me on my toes. That ship collides with another. And his wife hangs on as she watches those four daughters drown. And supposedly, eyewitnesses say, she tells them, the last thing she says is, don't be afraid. He made the sea. Or the sea is his and he made it. And so she sends Horatio a telegram and says, saved, but saved alone. What do I do? So Horatio makes his way to her on a ship across the Atlantic. And when they get to the point where the captain can best tell this is where it happened, he calls for Horatio. I don't know if I'd want to know as a dad. But he says, this is the point we think in the ocean where they died. And so Horatio goes back to his cabin and writes the words that we sing. Words like when sorrows like sea billows roll. In the season of misery, integrity. Because it is one thing to have integrity and obey God and have character when all is well. But it is in the valleys of life when it is, I don't know, is it sometimes that our true character is brought forth? Or is it that we allow that circumstance to lead us in one of two ways? Either for us to worship and depend on God and grow from it, or become bitter from it. Integrity. Now let's look at one more as we close. Integrity in the season of opportunity. Sometimes that's all that we need to lose our integrity. Integrity in the season of misery. When life breaks our heart and Satan does his worst, where are we? And then now, season of immorality. Immorality. His sin is in 2 Samuel 12. He's king. Back to a king. And that's fascinating in itself, isn't it? That Abimelech is king. Job isn't a king, but he's living like a king. And now King David, Israel's greatest king. And he sees what he wants. And he seizes what he wants. And he covers it up. You talk about power and manipulation and political corruption and sexual immorality. You got it. And Nathan the prophet is sent. Wouldn't you love to have that job? 2 Samuel 13, verse 13, his response to Nathan when Nathan says, David, it's you. David says, I have sinned against the Lord. And by inspiration, he pens Psalm 51 and then Psalm 32. I have them in there in the way they are written, 32, 51, but I almost think it should be 51, 32. 51 is the plead of penitence and brokenness. And it's amazing, isn't it, that David can at one point look so headstrong, so rebellious against God, and then the next moment, when he finally realizes what he's done, He is broken. And then Psalm 32 is the blessedness of forgiveness. Perhaps it is when we do lose our integrity, how we handle that, how we respond and or react to that, may be the truest sign of our integrity all along. Because you and I aren't going to maintain it totally or perfectly like we said at the beginning. If we could, at least in part, that would take away part of the reason we need the gospel. David needed a Messiah, just like you and I do. So there's his sin. There's his response. Here's his record. Look at these passages with me. Look at 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 4. This is actually God speaking to Solomon about his David, as Solomon is beginning his reign. Now, there's a couple of verses from Acts on your handout. Acts 7:47, where Stephen says he was favored in God's sight. Acts 13:22, which is where we get our famous saying from Paul's sermon there, that David was what? A man after whose own heart? God's. But he did all that. Look at 1 Kings 9, verse 4. He says, "And as for you, if you walk before me," speaking to Solomon, "as David your father walked with integrity of heart and uprightness." Now, is God just somehow for brushing over David's sin? No. Because it's not about whether David ever sinned. It's about the integrity of his heart and his wholeness and his brokenness by his sin. And then 11:6, our last passage for this evening, 1 Kings 11, verse 6, the downfall of Solomon, carried away into idolatry by all those wives. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 6. It says, "So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not," watch it, "wholly." There's that word. Not H-O-L-Y, but W-H, right? "Wholly follow the Lord." And then, as David his father had done. Now, you could read verse 6 of 1 Kings 11 and think, well, that means David never sinned, or at least he never did anything big. Maybe he lied once, or a little white lie. Maybe he wasn't the perfect king, but he'd never be sexually immoral. He'd never murder anybody. He'd never use his political position to cover it up. But he did. And isn't that part of the blessing? Knowing Jesus? I mean, in chronology, Jesus hasn't been born yet, but he is existent, pre-existent, for that matter. And the gospel message is on its way. So when God looks at us, he doesn't say, "You better do everything right or else." He looks at us and says, "I ask integrity, wholeness of your life." Integrity in the season of immorality. When we are not Abimelech, and maybe it's when we are Job and we are vulnerable. You've been there? You notice when you're tired? Seems like that's when Satan just wants you more than ever. And it might not be the temptation of an affair. It might be the irritableness with your kids or your grandkids or your spouse. And that's not even Job there. That's just had a long week, long day. And we become David. Key to integrity goes beyond always maintaining it in the first place. 3 seasons tonight of integrity. A call to us to be people who realize our failures, who realize I can't be everything I need to be. I'm glad Jesus came. But to also examine ourselves and say, that doesn't mean that I don't need to have integrity. So Shane's going to lead us in a song in just a moment. If you're not part of God's family tonight, why not? Why not tonight as we sing? And that's not the invitation song. But and maybe as we sing together, maybe it's a time to rethink and reorganize, redecide for integrity. And I'll leave you with this tonight. I ran across this. Someone made a list of ways to check our integrity. They said the way we react to minor inconveniences says a lot about our character. And so I amended it a bit. I added a couple. Here they are. I'll run through them quickly. Number 1, how we react when someone takes our parking spot. What we do when faced with the horror of slow internet or a long line. The gap between our thoughts and our words when we receive a compliment. When we say, oh, it was nothing. But on the inside, we're thinking, yeah, I did pretty good with that, didn't I? How we deal with criticism. How we handle making a mistake. When someone fills the trash can but doesn't empty it. Or they take something out of the dishwasher and don't empty the dishwasher. That just ruins everything. Our social media personality. How we react to other people's social media personality. And you get that sometimes who we are in real life isn't who we are online. What we do with a shopping cart. What we do when someone shares something confidential with us. Or then how we react to someone's request or needs that really just inconvenience our schedule. Integrity. Are you a person of integrity? As we stand together and sing.